session in today's symposium, which talks about Islamic movements in governance and politics. This week we're talking about the Islamic experience in Iran. This is the fourth symposium in this series, and we're going to have three speakers. The first paper is going to talk about the Republic of Iran and foreign policies by Mr. Muhammad Azimi from the Strategic Studies Center, and then Mr. Hassan Ahmadian from Tehran University, who's going to talk about the Islamic Republic and the West. And the third paper is going to be the Islamic Republic and the Resistance movement by Mr. Zari', who's member of the Strategic Studies Center as well. Mr. Hanif Azimi is a researcher in Islamic studies, and he is a graduate of the talented schools, and he has a bachelor in physics and has a master's degree in Quran and Hadith. He has many tenures, including a lecturer in Tehran and also a member of a Center Against the Secular Ideas in Tehran, and he's an executive director elsewhere. He has many publications and articles, including his master's dissertation, which talked about modern or relations amongst Muslim factions in the 3rd century. And Mr. Hassan Ahmadian has a PhD in the regional studies from about the MENA region, and also he also has his PhD master's degree from the same university. He has many publications, including the struggle over the future of Yemen and Saudi Arabia and future prospects and challenges, and Iran and the Middle East and social security in the Middle East, and many scholarly articles in issues related to Iran and the Middle East and the various crises in the region, including Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood, the crisis in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq. Our third speaker, Mr. Hadi Mazoum Zari', has a PhD in regional studies from the Tehran University and has many publications, particularly in issues related to Salafi, jihadi Salafism in different areas in the world, as well as about Islamic movements and the experience of Hezbollah and Amal movement in Lebanon, as well as many other publications and studies. We have afterwards two commentators, Dr. Issam Abdeshafi, who is the head of the International Relations Academy in Turkey and the head of the Egyptian Strategic Studies Center, has a PhD in political science from the University of Cairo and a master's degree in political studies from the same university. He was also a visiting professor in Studies Center, and also he lectured in Doha. He worked as professor as a lecturer in various universities in Egypt, as well as Sakarya University in Turkey, and also an associate professor in Al-Hadara Center in Egypt. We have also Dr. Ali Baraka, who is Palestinian from Al-Nazra. He was born in Al Burj al-Shamali camp in Lebanon, and he has a master's degree in history from the Lebanese University. He was a representative of Hamas in Lebanon until 2019, and he was also a member until 2020, and he is currently the head of National Relations Office abroad in Hamas. I'd like to welcome you all. As I mentioned, this session is going to tackle most importantly foreign relations. Our first paper is going to be about Iran and foreign politics and foreign policy. We have Mr. Hamid Azimi. Please go ahead, sir. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. This topic, I would like to draw your attention. I'd like to draw your attention to the importance of this topic I'm going to handle. So I would like to start from the end, so to speak, i.e. from the outcomes that this study concluded with. And those outcomes or those conclusions were not known for me beforehand, before starting the embarking on this study. That's why they came as this study was very fruitful for me, because when I was working on those foreign relations between Iran and Islamic movements in the region, I've been working on this for more than 7 years. But what I found out in the course of this particular study was very exciting, at least for me, and I hope that you would find it as interesting as well. Before I go into any further detail, there are 2 points. First of all, in this study, I had an assumption or a proposition at the beginning. This assumption was not something that was obvious for me 2 years ago, let's say, after all of the relations and the work I did with influential institutions that have impact on foreign relations in the Republic of Iran, I came up with this proposition, but I wanted to clarify it. But at the end of the day, it was a proposition or an assumption. So that assumption was that no institution in Iran, be it security agencies, diplomatic institutions, or cultural institutions, no single institution is assigned with the mission of managing the relations of Iran with revolutionary leaders in the region. This is actually an issue that has no institutional foundation, so to speak, in the Republic of Iran. This was my preliminary perception that a state as big and as outstanding as Iran must have institutions that are quite significant to manage this aspect. But I reached to this presumption 2 years ago, and I would refer you to the article in which I talked about this. This assumption is problematic, and this study comes from that problematic point, because revolutionary movements and the exportation of revolution, as we hear quite a lot from mass media, that this is part of the promotional discourse of the Republic of Iran. So this is a fundamental part of our discourse and our rhetoric. So how come was it not translated into the establishment of institutions? So this is important because this problem, which is the subject of this study, because it includes in the ultimate conclusion that the nature of the foreign policy of the authorities in Iran is inclined to be, in terms of performance and discourse, quite conservative, particularly in terms of identity and geography, so much so that it is that the rhetoric of speakers and leaders of Iran has become nationalist instead, after it used to be based on an Ummah and pan-Muslim rhetoric. And this is something I'm going to tackle in detail, but it's an observation that we can make, and I will clarify the reasons. So this change of rhetoric at the end, due to this change of rhetoric, the Iranian regime talks about pan-Muslim or Ummah issues only when it's they have common borders or common ideologies. This is, of course, something very significant. If we make this observation, I believe this is an important issue to investigate. So the question, this begs the question, what's the reason? What's the reason for that institutional void in terms of managing the relations with Islamic countries outside Iran? At the beginning of this study, I started with a presumption which I wasn't sure of, as I mentioned. But I assumed that this assumption may turn out to be true. The presumption was that this void, institutional void, may be related to the organization of liberation movements. So people in Iran know the importance of such establishments, particularly at the beginning of the first decade of the Islamic Revolution. And that's why I tried to uncover the relation between this early movement and its relation to the existing institutional void. Hence, let me move to the core of my paper and let me reiterate that it's important to go into details, but also because of translation considerations. And some friends for whom I read the article in Persian had much trouble understanding it, and there were actually many mistakes in the Persian translation, and I hope that this presentation now would convey what I wanted to say in this paper better. So the first point I wanted to reiterate is that when I undertook analyzing the political landscape in Iran in terms of its regional implications or its regional policies, first of all, we have to examine the roles of the left and the right in Iran, who, particularly in the first decade after the revolution, if you examine closely this political landscape, there was much debate and heated argument between the left and the right in order to understand the context, we need to understand the dialectics in between the left and the right in Iran. But this dialectic between the left and the right was subject to many studies about Iran and its political history after and before the revolution. But what could be said, or what can be said to be missing, or there are very few studies about, was about the third line, the third party, so to speak, between the left and the right, working in parallel with those two parties. So yes, we have the left and the right within the system of governance in Iran. Of course, I'm not talking globally, but this third party we rarely hear about, particularly outside Iran, because it was eliminated by the end of the first decade, and we can say that it was almost obliterated or separated from the the political history of Iran. However, they continue to have impact on Iranian foreign policy, particularly in the region and neighboring countries, which is the subject of this study. So I believe, as is well known in the Iranian political history studies, the first decade of the Islamic Republic can be said to be leftist. So obviously, after a revolution, the predominant force was the left. Why? Because they were the main power that gave rise to the revolution. They took to the streets. They promoted the revolution in the squares and in the streets, etc. But the significant change that took place after that was the Iraqi Iranian War, and I believe that this war caused a radical transformation in Iran from the left to the right, and this needs to be studied. Why the Iraqi Iranian War caused that radical change in the political arena or political landscape in Iran. More importantly, in terms of the relation between Iran and its surroundings, this war happened in parallel or simultaneously with the Afghan war. So Iran was surrounded by war to the east and west. That changed the political orientation of the Iranian political landscape. And I believe this is understood by my colleagues here, how also the Afghan war affected the perspective of Sunni security. If you can track down all the movements, they have a sort of a memory to the Afghan war. The same applies to Iran in terms of the Iranian-Iraqi war, which caused a drastic change and a transformation in the political landscape in Iran. So I could call the first decade of the Republic as the first Republic, and afterwards it's the second Republic. It's as though it was a different Republic because the political landscape and even the political ideology changed quite drastically. So an important point to go back to that institutional void, there was also the miscarriage of the reproduction of the revolution. When we talk about the exportation of the revolution, how did the Islamic revolution in its first decade obliterate its own reproduction mechanisms? This is related directly to that third party, which are neither left nor right. What are the characteristics of that third party? How do they demarcate themselves from the left and the right? In my opinion, the main characteristic of this line is that they have a regard for the Muslim Ummah. Of course, this was not totally rejected by the left and the right in Iran, but the main feature and the important feature, defining feature of that third party, that by which it differentiates itself from the others, was its belonging to the idea of the Muslim Ummah. So this movement distanced itself from conservative Shia doctrine and from the secular left. So because it was clear that the conservative Shia movement, it was clear that they were at the far right, but this idea of the Muslim Ummah and stressing the Muslim identity was the main identity distinction of that movement in distancing itself and in defining itself as opposed to the left and the right, in order to start a discourse based on revolution and exporting the revolution to its Sunni, or communicating the revolution with its Sunni surroundings. So they needed a discourse that was quite amicable. So this third line or third party is known as the theorists, or the most important theorist is Ayatollah al-Muntaziri, whom we know a lot about his disagreements and problems with other movements in the leadership of the revolution. What we know about the Muntaziri and his ideology is that he was looking for an Islamic jurisprudence that interacts better or more intimately with the Sunni school, and he expanded this from other scholars and theorists. So he defined himself, al-Muntaziri, by this kind of jurisprudence within the same context. Ayatollah Asif Muhsin, who was one of the outstanding students of al-Muntaziri, who in turn was trying to purify the Shia legacy or heritage from some impurities, which would draw it closer to the Sunni ideology on an ideological level. He also worked on outlining the ideas and ideology of this movement, and his book was entitled The Eternal or Immortal Martyr, which caused a lot of polarization amongst the scholars from the left or the right. Okay, I will try to be brief to finish in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. So apart from that theoretical level, on the practical implementation level, we have the Organization of Liberation Movements, which was headed by Sheikh Muntadhiri, and then after he was martyred at the hand of Mujahidi Khalq, we had Majdi al-Hashimi, who is known for his disagreements with political leaders in Iran. This organization was primarily part of the Revolutionary Guard at the beginning, but it had a different orientation that focused, for example, on the situation in Afghanistan instead of focusing on the Iraqi Iranian war. And even in Iraq, their focus was mostly on Kurdistan, where the Sunnis were constituted a majority. So everywhere they shed light on, where they were trying to forge relations with the Sunni components in the Muslim world. However, there were major issues with the performance of this organization. This organization, as I mentioned in my article, was unable to form a successful model. So it itself failed to reach the ideals it set forth, and it was naturally eliminated from the political landscape. But this elimination or this omission happened in a very polarized organization environment. So this person at the end of the day was executed, and all the members were removed from institutional posts within the regime. But this created what I would call a psychological impact in the mind of the ruling elite in the regime, although so that even if they did not disagree totally with this reinterpretation of the revolution or of those approaches, but this organization shed such negative light and brought up some negative memories, so much so that it became self-marginalized and repulsive. So this is what happened, although inexplicitly. And more importantly, apart from its impact on the rhetoric, it impacted the structure of the institution. So we have an omission of an institution with no replacement. So we had those relations with the various movements, etc., but the omission of that institution rendered those relations into personal relations and created an institutional void. So this What remained was the rhetoric that focused on a national religious discourse after it was regional and Muslim Ummah based. I thank you a lot. I hope I've been clear in my Arabic rendition of this paper. Thank you so much, Mr. Hamid, for this presentation, which talked about the relation with the region, particularly with revolutionary movements in the region.
He started talking about the results or the findings of the research that he's conducting, and the findings were unexpected. He didn't start with any results, and the research came to these findings. That was very interesting, which was the relation between the different parties in this study. Before getting into the study, he mentioned 2 points. First is that there is a presupposition that wasn't clear for him 2 years ago, which was in the relation of all the institutions that are affecting the foreign policy, and no certain institution that was related to the policy of the state or the revolutionary institutions within Iran. That wasn't very clear for him, but he was surprised that a state like the Republic didn't have certain institutions concerned with that. So that there was a problematic issue, which was the relation with other states and the exporting the revolution as one of the slogans of the revolution. And he raises the question how this narrative leads to establishing institutions that answer this question. And this study reached the final conclusion that the nature of the foreign policy was tending towards a conservative nature. He spoke about the identity and the geography, and the narrative of the Republic became more as sectarian Shia narrative more than a cross-border or cross-geography narrative. Because of the change or the shift in this narrative, the regime in Iran didn't deal with the institutions, with the governmental institutions, apart from some direct relations in a limited way, and only if it is linked with it on the school of thought, which is the Shia. So the question here remains is what is the relation with the other Shia revolutionary parties? He has that there is a feeling that maybe that through the relation with other Islamic movements that are influential in the decision making. He found that when he started to read when he read the translation of his paper, he found that there were problems in the translation, so maybe we need to retranslate it into Arabic in order to make sure that all the message was there. Then he speaks about the political sphere that affects Iran, and he says that we need to understand when we speak about the foreign policy in the first decade of the Republic, the role of the left and the right in the Republic, and when he is speaking there, he is speaking about the political sphere within Iran, not outside Iran, or within the system. So he said, when we look at from outside the borders into Iran, we need to understand the left and the right and their influence within Iran and within the political sphere. And here we need to understand that within the Islamic context, what a lot of people don't think that there was a third line, or and that line became extinct after the first decade of the revolution, but it has a very important influence. And he then explained what's the meaning of the left and the right and the third line. He said that the first decade of the Republic was par excellence a leftist decade, because it was and the Islamic current, it was the one that incited the revolution. But when the Iraqi-Iran war became the movements within Iran, political movements went from the left to the right. The left was open to the revolutionary movements. The right was more conservative about the geography and the borders. This war, or the Iraqi Iranian war, it was going on at the same time the Afghani war was going on, which changed a lot of the concepts within the Sunni realm. And the same thing happened with the Shia realm, and it changed the nature of the Iranian people in terms of the relations. In the first decade, the Islamic Republic is different from the following decades. And he then spoke how the revolution started the revolution restoration body, which led to the third line. And here he explained the third line, which is speaking about the pan nation or the pan Islamic nation, and this was different from the right conservative, which is purely Shia, or the left that was more modern. So this third line started with a narrative in order to export the revolution into the Sunni realm. This can be the figures of that line, Abdullah al-Muntadhiri, and the differences with that person with others. And he was looking in the Shia heritage things that are considered to be common grounds with the Sunni heritage. And in the same context, Ayatollah Asif Muhsini was in the same line, and he was trying to purify the Shia heritage from the arrogance and make it more in line with the Sunni heritage. He said also that there was an organization that wanted to continue the relations with other Sunni parties, but it didn't. But it failed in all of the files, and that led to extreme polarization and left a very negative influence or impact on the popular movement and in the leadership, that led into changes into the institutional structure. And there was no alternative, so the relations became more personal or on the individual basis instead of being institutional or structural. And that led that the republic became more or this line of thought was more national rather than being pan-Islamic. The finding was really shocking, but it deserves more or deeper understanding. Now we move to the third speaker. Please, the floor is yours. In the name of God, peace be upon you. I would like to thank the organizers of this symposiums. Peace be upon you all. Talking about Iran and the West. Do you hear me? Do you hear me, Mr. President? Yes, it's perfect. Continue, please. Thank you. So, speaking about Iran and the West / Iran, the US relations is an easy yet difficult issue to speak about, because it's difficult because you cannot come up with the new things, and usually you are going to repeat what is already known. I tried in my paper to not to repeat what is already known and to get something that is new, to get away from the boredom that that contains all the papers that are issued about the US-Iran relations in specific, or that surrounds that. So I will start with covering the present and modern history about the Western Iranian relations into three pieces, and then I'm going to put these pieces together and combine them to come up with the conclusion, which is the way I see the current relations based on the past or the history of that relation. I will start with the first image, which is the periods of the subordinate ally. That was before the 1979. Iran was an ally slash subordinate to the Western camp in the face of the Eastern camp. It was playing international regional roles for this camp and facing the Eastern camp and its expansion, specifically the Soviet Union. For example, Iran participated in supporting the Western forces in the Vietnamese War, and it was directly involved in crushing the Dhifar movement in Oman, as well as other wars or conflicts. So it supported the Western benefit or the Western interests in the face of the Eastern expansion. That's why the monarchy was receiving benefits for that loyalty, and that benefits had different materialization or different shapes. For example, the coup of 1953, where the elected government was removed and the monarchy came back to power, which was in alliance with the United States, or buying the advanced weapons from the United States and other Western countries. We can compare that with the allies of the United States now in the region and how much weaponry they are getting. So that was the price of the loyalty to the United States. And the decade before the revolution, or the decade ended in 1979, that was the nature of that period, and that's what the United States gives to the monarchy that was an ally and a loyal to the United States. So the result was an expanded regional role of Iran under or playing within the framework of the American interest. In that context, Iran was very active. Its power was increasing and becoming influential in the region. But that model, the model of the subordinate, loyal or ally, was rejected by the revolution for several reasons, and most prominently, I believe, things that has to do with the modern history of Iran, because there is a collective memory that pushes against getting into alliance with the Western country, and that led to a strategic culture and strategic policy that confronted even or challenged the dialogue with major powers. But even within the dialogue, they are this collective memory is putting itself away from that, because there is a narrative in Iran that this dialogue or alliance with the West made Iran smaller in influence and in geography, and it became a subordinate country. That's why there was a collective narrative which called for toppling the monarchy, and the king was called the American king in Iran, the Shahi America, and because of his subordination to the United States. Or, for example, other slogans like neither Eastern nor Western, it's an Islamic republic, which means getting away from making alliance with neither camp during the Cold War. After the toppling of the regime, in the period of after 1979, it is the period of enmity or hostility. The main nature was hostility and containment. There was hostility between Iran and the United States, Iran and other Western countries, as there were attempts of containment of Iran within or in addition to that hostility. We lost the sound from the speaker. Dr. Hassan, you were away for 1 minute. You were talking about hostility and containment. So please repeat. Okay, I will start with the second image now. The second image is hostility and containment. There was mutual hostility between Iran and the United States and attempts to contain the revolutionary Iran by the United States and its allies in the West and in the region. This containment is taking several shapes. Iran was getting out of the Western cloak and is trying to get away with itself from the East and the West, the main two camps in the world. And there are Western pressures to contain Iran, which was taking several shapes. One of these shapes, a military form, through supporting the war against Iraq. In other periods, there were other forces that were supported in order to keep Iran away from expansion. And this is one of the shapes of containment. And there are other shapes, like, for example, cornering Iran, weakening and undermining Iran, or demonizing Iran and showing it as the irrational player that is trying to destabilize the region. So in general, there are continuing containment attempts, also materializing in the sanctions that are taking place against Iran, even before getting into or breaking into the U.S. embassy in Iran. So the hostility started there, and the containment attempt started at that point. In the face of this containment, Iran developed its strategy that links the regional aspect with the international aspect, because what Iran has built is not far away from its borders. And the aim of that strategy is to undermine the American strategy or the American interest in the region. So the strategy of containment rise again or resurface. And this was an attempt to face the Americans by building the self powers as well as making regional alliances. I will move now to the third picture for the time, and if there is more time during the question and answers, we can get. The other strategy was the deterrence strategy, which also took a clear regional dimension in the face of Israel. And until today, it is a strategy through which Iran is trying to undermine the threat that is facing Iran. So containment, or this strategy is trying to face the military threats. So Iran is building its self powers, self forces, and making external alliances in order to have a complete system of deterrence internally and regionally in order to protect itself and to protect its allies. So building the capabilities started with the Iraqi-Iran war, and then with the development of the missile program, Iranian missile programs, and the military industry within a vision that Iran is pursuing. The aim of the response is to enable Iran to face the threats of its enemies, so which will open more space for Iran to respond against the United States and the West. The result was two images. The first one tells us, in this period, of course, the first one tells us that the Western pressure and the threats continued against Iran, which means that Iran stayed under pressure for at least for 3 decades, remained under that pressure, and some people see that it is still under that pressure in the fourth decade. And the 2 strategies that I mentioned that were pursued by Iran led to an increase of the force of Iran in the region, and that is represented in the resistance axis that Dr. Al-Masumi spoke about. However, this, I said that in the first image, Iran's regional activity increased. At the time, that was under the American strategy in the region. This time, those who see that Iran's policy or the increase of the Iran in the region is independent this time, and that is the major difference that the supporters of this vision speak about. The third image, which is resulting from the second image, which I call containment through negotiations. Iran and the United States, for the first time, are getting into public and direct negotiations to speak about 2 key issues. The first one is parts of the capabilities that are built within Iran, the nuclear capabilities, and the second one, removing or suspending the sanctions imposed against Iran. So in this period, the United States is trying to contain Iran through the strategy of containment through engagement, and Iran is trying to contain the United States through negotiations. So the 2 strategies are getting closer to each other. This period came as a result of the previous image or the previous period, and it led to raising the voice of the importance of conducting negotiations between Iran and the United States. I need to focus here that since the 1990s, 3 Iranian governments continuously tried to negotiate with the United States. In 1995, for the first time, the Conoco, the U.S. giant, was supposed to have a $1 billion project in Iran, the largest project in Iran in the history of Iran for a gas field. But the Congress and the administration of Clinton rejected that through the Damaton bill that prevented inventing more than 45 million US dollars, and that's why the late Hashemi failed in engagement in negotiations with the United States to limit the threats that are present. So then the government of Mr. Khatami, he tried through the dialogue of civilizations to make some logistical assistance or cooperation with the United States in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but it was faced with a hostile narrative, creating the so-called axis of evil, that Iran was part of it, demonizing Iran. And there was talks about the use of Afghanistan and Iraq as platforms to launch attacks against Iran. And against this was pursued, or this narrative was pursued by the main institutions in the United States. So this failed. And the third attempt was with the big deal that was talked in the United States in 2008, but the Iranians didn't talk about it or didn't respond to it because we felt that the Iran is strong and we don't need that. So these calls for the dialogue only came when the nuclear power be increased and President Obama started to make this dialogue. The Iranian strategy was always to be on equal footing, to have dialogue or negotiations on equal footings, and at the same time to have containment. So the result was the deal of 2015 after lengthy negotiations for several years. In 2015, we have seen, or we have witnessed, signing the nuclear deal which suspended part of the Iranian nuclear program, and Iran provided unprecedented transparency about its nuclear program in exchange of suspending some of the sanctions. The deal continued until 2018 only, and then we went back to the second image. So there is a flashback to the second period, or the second image, which is the hostility and containment strategy. With Biden coming to presidency, we started to go back to the third image, which is containment through engagement. We don't hear a lot about what is happening in that field now, but I will stop here in order to evaluate these three images through combining them and coming up with an entire image that summarizes the relations between the United States and Iran, or the Western countries. Until 1979, Iran was a main part of the Western power in the region. So Iran was in the center of that. There is a center in the region that is subordinate and making alliance with the West and with the United States. Iran was a main part of this center. And it was confronting the Soviet expansion in the region as part of that part. The year 1979 and the revolution brought Iran out of that alliance. The new policy started, or the relation changed completely between the United States, or the West, and Iran. Iran was excluded, and it was taken out of this system in the region, or this order in the region. And when it was excluded from this order in the region, it was put under the spotlight and demonized, but in order to change its political nature. Until doing that, it will remain under the spotlight and under the strategy of containment. Under this reality, from this center, or the system that is allied with the West, and this excluded part or system with a lot of media and economic pressure against Iran, Iran focused on the surroundings instead of trying to come back to the center. And it's built a surrounding or a periphery that is completely different from the past, because Iran wasn't the only system or regime that was excluded. There was a group of the excluded powers, or the untouchables, and it tried to make alliance with those groups in this surrounding. And we lost the speaker again. We lost you when you were saying that Iran was building alliances with the surrounding powers in this system. Yes. So instead of getting back to the center, it depended on building alliances with the surrounding of countries that are excluded from the American policy, and those who are considered to be untouchable or alienated by the United States. So the focus on this surrounding, or the periphery, instead of playing a role in the center and building relations with the center, Iran focused on those surroundings. As a result, and as a result of the ongoing pressure of the United States, which is the policy of containment and the confrontational Iranian strategy, Iran managed to build a harmonized or hegemonous surrounding to some extent. This surrounding, the self-capabilities in that system and the strategies based on the general strategies that, as I understood them in the Iran since in the first decade of the revolution, they were focusing on these two axes: building self-capabilities and building independent alliances. So this will lead, or the civilized building will become the higher purpose, if you like. So we lost him again. So, in the fourth decade of the Islamic Revolution, we reached the periods of dealing between the center and the peripheral or peripheries on equal footing. At least at the level of the form, it gives Iran a legitimacy and as well as power to face the center that is allied with the United States. That's why we find that the relation of Iran with the center of that system that is affiliated with the United States is increasing because of its power that it was able to build. So that leads us to the last image, which is containment through engagement, and this which is built on this conflict between the periphery and the center. And that's why this issue upsets a lot of people in the United States because they find that this is inappropriate for them or with the tradition that they have with the alliances with the United States. The paradigm of alliance with the United States is the paradigm or the model of the subordinate ally to build a practical to build relation with someone who can follow orders. That is the model that the United States want. Of course, now what we have in the United States, we have the Republicans who reject dealing with Iran, and part of the Democrats, they deal with Iran only based on their priorities, and they are focusing mainly on China and the rising powers. I will stop here, and I can add something during the question and answers if you want. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmadian. And to summarize what he presented, he said that speaking about the Islamic Republic in the West is plenty, and he doesn't want to repeat what is being said, so he wanted to make something that might be different, but he agrees in the conclusions. And in order not to raise or to bore you with the details, and he said that so he started with painting 3 images and then combining them together to come up with one image. The first image was the pre-revolution period in 1970, before 1979, and he called it the period of the subordinate ally in terms of the relation with the United States, which means that Iran was a subordinate ally with the Western camp, and it was playing a major role with the West in its international camps, whether in the Far, in Oman, or in Afghanistan, where Iranian soldiers were sent there, and all of that was serving the Western camp against the Eastern camp represented by the Soviet Union, and it was awarded with loyalty and, for example, by the coup and bringing back the Shah, or giving weapons, as the case is now with the allies of the United States in the region. After the revolution, so the role of the subordinate loyal ally was also on the increase with the United States, but that was rejected internally. So this role was destroyed completely after the revolution, and that was one of the reasons of the revolution, because of the collective memory that created a political culture that rejects talking with international parties, because it weakens Iran and making it lose its independence, especially that some of the slogans were toppling the American king, and no Eastern, neither Western nor Western, in order not to get involved with any of the international agendas. The second image was the containment through the hostility and containment, hostility between Iran and the United States, and containment of Iran by the United States and its allies. This policy had several materialization. One of the materializations was the military attempt through supporting the Saddam Hussein regime during the war, supporting Iran to keep the balance, or also cornering Iran and playing or showing the propaganda that Iran is an irrational player and destabilizing the region. On the other hand, Iran adopted strategies whose aim was to undermine the American policy in the region through building self-capabilities and building regional alliances, which was the counter, he calls counter containment. Also, one of the strategies that was the other strategy was the deterrence strategy, in order to undermine the threatening strategy that was followed by Iran, by the United States, which means the deterrence was through military operations, also through the regional networks who were building or relying on their self-capacity or capabilities, and building missile programs in order to counter the attempts of the enemies that are trying to limit or curtail the ability of Iran to move. So the result was getting into under pressure that will continue to be there for 3 decades, and the increase of the energy, the power of Iran as an independent power. The third image, which was a result of the second image, and we can say that it started in the second term of Obama, and that was a containment through negotiations, and where the Iran and the United States got into direct public negotiations in order to curtail or contain Iranian powers through negotiations. So it was containing the threats presented by Iran through negotiations, which means containment and counter-containment. This image about the negotiation with the United States was an old one, and there were several attempts by Rafsanjani and Khatami to speak with the United States, and he said that there was an attempt by the Congress, or there was an attempt for, but the Congress rejected an investment in Iran. But after Iran was put in the axis of evil, we went back to the containment and counter-containment strategy again, and once again we were speaking about using Afghanistan and Iraq as a platforms to launch attacks against Iran. Then we are talking about the big deal between Iran and the United States in 2008, but it seemed, but Iran rejected to do anything because it felt that it was strong. And after 2015, or in 2015, after lengthy negotiations, we have seen the deal, or signing a deal, suspending the sanctions and suspending part of the nuclear program of the Iran until 2018, where we went back to the containment program or strategy. And now with Biden, we are going again to the image of containment through engagement or through negotiations. So now what we see is that Iran, before the revolution, it was a subordinate ally with the West, confronting the expansion of the Soviet Union. But after that, Iran became out of that center, and it became there was a lot of pressure on Iran to change its policy, and we started to see the policy of containment at all levels: economic, political, and social. On the other hand, we started to see a new strategy depending on the peripheries instead of the center, to build alliances with this surrounding away from the American policy. It also relied on building capabilities instead of playing a role in the center of the alliance with the United States. So the strategy of Iran was to make alliances with the surroundings of Iran, building independent allies based on the general strategy, and it was depending on these two axes through this civilized vision. After that, we got into the dealing between the center and the peripheries on equal footing, which means that Iran is a legitimate power in this periphery, and in the center, which is affiliated to the United States, they are dealing with Iran on equal footing. For example, the negotiations in the nuclear negotiations in Vienna is part of that, and it's upsetting a lot of those in the United States because they don't feel that this is appropriate for the United States to get into a relationship that is almost on equal footing. And so there are a lot of those who reject to negotiate with a country that wants to become an equal adversary and not a subordinate. Thank you very much. Now we get to the third speaker by Mr. Masoom Zara, and it's about Iran and the axis of resistance.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, dear participants and professors, dear guests in this blessed gathering, I will start, and I will avoid any introductions to make the best use of time. We all know that the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran was one of the most important factors for the renewed interest in the Palestinian cause and for the renewed hope in resistance forces to heal Islamic wounds and address Islamic issues. The success of the Islamic Revolution and the support of resistance movement over the first 15 years of the revolution's history, whether Sunni or Shia, has made a question come up to the minds of politicians and analysts about the principles that the revolution has towards resistance movements. Is it from strategic interests, or is it because of an eagerness to strike a balance between adversaries, or because of a sort or a specific frame of reference or a set of values? I will address this question in the course of my paper, but it's noteworthy to point out two issues. First of all, unlike any other country, the Islamic Republic of Iran is quite dynamic and politically and ideologically, and has different movements, revolutionary and otherwise, across the political spectrum. And surely it's natural that certain factors would play into decisions and into positions. But that's the second point. Our focus is going to be about the revolutions regard to resistance because of their dominance of this issue over the past decades. Of course, there are other points of view or other perspectives in the Iranian political sphere and in political leaders. Hence, we may find some contradictions. But to add to what Mr. Hamid mentioned, that I disagree with him actually, because of my action in the field in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as the Palestinian cause, and my presence in person in this region. I would doubt how absolute his points are, but I would not refute them altogether, because I would think that Iran, I'm always, when I talk about Iran's relation with the resistance, I feel desperate because of the accusations of being Shia or of being Rafidi or otherwise. But this doesn't, to talk in absolute terms and say that resistance movement have become Shia and nationalist is quite absolutist and untrue, although those generalizations are mostly failed. And this has caused the desperation among some decision makers in Iran in relation to cooperating with Sunni circles in the Arab region. And the examples are many, including the Muslim Brotherhood and even the Taliban recently, which shows, unlike what Mr. Hamid said, that they had, that the leftists had this ummah-based vision, while the right look from a Shia perspective. To the contrary, actually, this interaction with Sunni resistance movements was in the 90s, post the 90s, when Bosnia, even in Taliban and with the Muslim Brotherhood, and during the struggle between Taliban and the Americans, it was all interaction done by what Mr. Hamid called the right. So to case in point is that Al-Khomeini was a major fan of Sayyid Qutb, and he translated and read many of his publications. So it's not related to what he mentioned in terms of the right or the left, rather than talking about a Shia perspective in Iran. Another point is that based on that every generalization has certain exceptions. There are exceptions in every context. So if we look at the Shia context and decision making, it doesn't mean there is consensus. We see some exceptions in certain issues. For example, the issue of invaders and occupiers and how to deal with them. It's sort of the same as we see among Muslim, Sunni scholars, where there is room for disagreement. But in terms of the Islamic Republic, we had 4 principles over the past 40 years of the victory of the revolution, particularly in relation to Palestine and the resistance to occupation. First is the principle of struggling or rejecting coercion. Many analysts, including Iranian analysts, regard issues in a coercive manner. I believe the main principle is the rejection of coercion, because, as you know, it's important to protect the property rights, and that people are entitled to their property, and based on this, any transgression against the property of others would cause chaos and threaten internal civil peace, and that's why any usurpation of property would be dealt with in the most fierce penalties in Islam. And this usurper would actually pay back a reparation, would compensate for the property that been usurped and would be penalized. All of these are the repercussions of usurpation, which means that the Islamic legislature has been very strict in terms of addressing usurpation. But what happened in Palestine over the past decades, it constitutes particularly one of the most tenacious forms, horrendous forms of usurpation of a common property, not only individual property. Hence, particularly since this usurpation is susceptible to be recurrent and to be widespread, has to be resisted regardless of affiliation, religion, or race, because this usurpation is an injustice that is cross-border. Israel is an usurper that was based on usurpation, and it took over, even if it is any nation, even if it's not in the Middle East, even if it's not Arab, even if it's not a Muslim. So the idea that this nation was Muslim, that's a marginal issue. Regardless whether those are people who are with us or against us, Muslim or non-Muslim, the point is that they are the owners of this land, and it has been usurped by Israel. Ultimately, any proposition of a two-state solution or any other approaches that appease the occupier are but a reconciliation with usurpation. Of course, there is a good Jew and a bad Jew, but we will not accept the idea of a good Israeli, because the very identity of Israel was based on usurpation, on something that's absolutely unjust. I have to be brief here, so I will move quicker. What is surprising is that even though we recognize that this is able to recur in other geographies, many countries run and make relations with Israel, particularly those who are seeking normalization and of relations, who are begging for usurpation, basically. So this is the first principle, the confrontation of usurpation. This is a threat that could threaten Iran, the Emirates, Turkey. Now we have a legitimization of this precedent of the establishment of a state, of a displaced or a migrant population on the land of the indigenous people. So this is a principle that this is something that is a threat to all of us. So before defending the Palestinian people, we are defending our own future, because this could recur on one day on Iranian territories. So regardless of whether Palestine is Muslim or not, in Middle East or not, it has to be protected. Also, the second principle is the avoidance of madhab or religious school disagreements. Over the past 40 decades, the policies were not just tactical and based on temporary interests, but actually they are deep or finally, rooted in Shia ideology, and Iran does not makes no secret of its ideology being a continuation of that ideology. First of all, we have the fight against the British in the World War II, particularly in Iraq. As you know, at the time, Iraq was under the Sunni Ottoman Empire, not the Shia. So the Sayyid Ismail and the most important Shia scholars and Al-Khurasani and others sent Muhammad V Sultan a letter saying that all Muslims have to avoid any causes for bloodshed amongst Muslims. And they were addressing a sultan who is a Sunni, and they addressed him as the person in charge who is holding up the banner of the Muslim Ummah, who should protect the Muslim blood, and that he should issue a letter to protect the Muslim bloodshed in the course of what is basically a European war. So at that point, it wasn't a Shia or Sunni question. It was merely a Muslim question, a Muslim Ummah. And also we have another letter addressed to Al-Kufa in which the Shia scholars said that everybody have to work to defend against the enemies, and also Ayatollah mentioned the jihad is imperative on all Muslims of the world, and that those coming from the UK, France, and elsewhere have to be fought against, and all Muslims living in those countries have to refrain from assisting the allies from their onslaught on the Ottoman Empire, even if they are executed. So someone asked Ayatollah Khashani, can we support the occupiers against Muslims? He would be considered someone who is the enemy of God and the Prophet Muhammad, and if he is not deterred, he needs to be disowned if he is next of kin. So, and some others actually went to the front lines in the south of Iraq and joined ranks with the Ottoman commander, and they stood hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder. And some of those scholars were wounded or martyred, and some were arrested or imprisoned, and some were exiled. And I'm citing a book, but I can't find its name. He wrote that all historians, without exception, with Muslims or non-Muslims, said that the fatwas of Najaf and the Shia scholars have declared jihad against the British, and it was the main motive for the liberation of Iraq. And some scholars did not suffice themselves with merely issuing a fatwa, but actually took up arms there themselves. Some people may think that those are scholars who were already in Iraq and who were concerned for their own survival. But there was another fatwa to defend Libya. In 1911, the Italian forces came to Libya, and Sheikh Omar al-Mukhtar was involved in jihad against Italy. But miles away, hundreds of miles away in Iraq, we had the Shia scholars who issued a fatwa to actually fight the Italian occupiers in Libya as well as the Russian occupiers in Iran at the time. So those four Shia scholars saying that the Tripoli in Libya, which is one of the most important Muslim cities, has been occupied and attacked. And why aren't you not answering the call of the Muslims who are being slaughtered there? And they said that all Muslims have to gather and ask their governments to stop any illegal agreements with Italy and Russia, and consider that this Islamic movement is comparable to the Battle of Badr at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And another fatwa or a message by the Shia scholars, it talked about the occupation of Tripoli and of Iran, and saying that there are many threats against Islam. But these are important fatwas, and I don't believe that many of you have ever heard about them. They said that Muslims have to sacrifice their money and their souls to expel the Italian occupiers. You will find all of those fatwas in Arabic. I will share them with you. And in Najaf, the scholars gathered and talked to the people with much oratory and much motivational speeches, and started to poetry about Palestine. And they talked about the men of Palestine who are asking for help, then that Muslims and each individual would be asked for their duty towards their Muslim brethren in Palestine. Okay, and there were dozens of such verses, but let me then move to also the poets of the Islamic Revolution who wrote poetry against the US and against Israel. We have statements that talked more than 500 times in letters and statements about the issue of Israel and the Israeli occupation. And everybody knows today that this sentiment towards Palestine before and after the revolution has been costing Iran quite dearly. And the Iranian backwardness in economic terms and the Western sanctions against Iran is directly related to Iran's position from the Israeli entity. So, and all of the other problems can be contained, can be managed, can be negotiated, except for animosity towards Israel. So today, Iran is under much pressure because of its position towards Palestine, while other issues can be negotiated. Even the issue of defensive capabilities of Iran and Iranian missiles can be negotiated. And what's the irony is that this Iranian support to the Palestinian cause over the past 40 years, regardless of those economic and political price that is paid by Iranians, it actually caused division within the Shia ranks. So outside, everybody is talking about Iran being Shia and being sectarian, but within Iran, the people within the Shia school of thought, there is a division that some people are accusing the leadership of giving up some Shia priorities or Shia interests for the interest of the Sunnis. And I don't want to generalize that, but many Sunnis accuse Iran of being sectarian. But within the Shia sect, some figures are accused of making concessions to the interest of the Sunni people. So why have you become more involved in this than the owners of that cause? So Iran is under two sorts of pressure from the outside with the accusation of being sectarian, etc., and another pressure from within Iran that accuses it of giving concessions and having a Sunni inclination, and that some Shia interests are being given up in the interest of Sunni interests. The third principle, which is quite important and is related to, it could be elaborated upon in a separate session, which is the issue of the priority given to fighting foreign occupation in the case that we can't have both an active Muslim and good governance and fight the occupation, we always, in the Shia ideology, give paramount priority to fighting the occupation because of the experience of the Shia scholars in Iraq with the Ottoman Empire, and even with and also with the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, the Sunni Ottoman Empire. They were very critical of both their local government as well as the Sultanate. However, when things came down to the occupation, they would support the local authoritarianism, not out of accepting authoritarianism, but out of dealing with it as a de facto. So either we go in to fight this internal issue for freedom and justice, or we first go to fight our occupiers from without and then reform ourselves from within. So the Shia line of thought would give a priority to those external occupiers, to fighting external occupiers. For example, the experience of Hezbollah in the 80s, which had much problem with the Maronite Christian sect in Lebanon, but they were concerned with leaving aside any sectarian or local strife within Lebanon, but focus on our external occupiers. And apart from an incident in 2008, there were no. I remember that there was an incident in which the army killed a number of Shia members of the Shia community who were protesting for power shortage, and even the Syrian army made certain killings as well, and Hezbollah avoided going into any of those side battles because they had the priority of the external occupation, which is Israel. So we have many election circles for more than 40 years, and in Iran, they said that actually resistance of occupiers is not possible without democracy and the support of the people, and they need, but or this authoritarian regime's alignment with the resistance powers or resistance movements is only transient and based on dynamic concerns of interests. And nonetheless, we know it very well in the Islamic revolution. So if temporarily, due to de facto factors, we are unable to have both democracy and resistance, and so they are not contradictory, but what we are saying that due to certain conditions, we may be unable to combine both, then we give priority to resistance. The other point is that in this case, we will have the value of democracy taking second priority to resistance only temporarily until resistance is fruitful and we start with our democratic process. And we have the issue in Hezbollah, and actually the involvement of Iran in Syria was based on that point. I was surprised this morning when people talked about Iran being confronting and countering the revolutions in the Arab world. If we look at the endeavors in Astana in trying to link the Syrian opposition and the Syrian regime with Iranian mediation and with Turkish mediation, if they had accepted this, we would not have reached here probably. I don't want to go into those details, but the logic behind the Iranian intervention in Syria was that if the regime in Syria is toppled without a clear regime, a clear alternative that gives a guarantee for the resistance, in this case, it would be horrible, and we will postpone democracy because of resistance right now. So the fourth principle is that the Islamic revolution is committed to supporting resistance movements against occupation and against separatist movements, particularly when those separatist movements are supported by foreign actors. From the point of view of the revolution of the Islamic Republic, the separation from a Muslim or a non-Muslim country. Let's say a Muslim movement would want to separate from a Muslim country. This is contrary to the idea of the Muslim Ummah, as well as with the national security and national interests of Iran. The world now is more in need of cohesion and than with fragmentation. If you remember, the Houthi sat with Al-Khomeini in Tehran, and one of the most important issues discussed was the idea of geographic unity of Yemen, because there were certain attempts to work with the separatist council that was trying to separate the south from the rest of Yemen. He said that in Yemen we would not accept the separation or the division of Yemen, even if that was for the best of the Houthis. As the separation from a non-Muslim country is something that may be acceptable only in one case, when the country in question and the authority in position was against religious practice and has a genocidal attitude, or could obliterate the doctrine or the practice of the religion. So the continuance in that country would be to eliminate one's own identity, like what happened in Bosnia in the past century. So the Iranian Republic was one of the most important supporters of the resistance movement against the Serbs, and supported the Bosnian Muslim non-Sunni community, which was miles away from Iran. So because of the common values, and hence going with those unfruitful arguments or fights with non-Muslim countries is not something that the Republic of Iran supports. So you could actually stay within a government that is not Muslim if it is peaceful and non-coercive. It could actually be an opportunity for dawah, for mutual communication, but otherwise it's not. Now we notice that there are many movements have become, instead of being liberation movements, they have become separatist movements before even also being Islamic movements. So those are the four main principles of the Islamic revolution in Iran. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there may be some divergent points of view within the Iranian framework, which may affect certain decisions, but these four principles reflect the main line of thought. And of course, I don't speak for the Islamic Republic, nor do I speak for the revolutionary the Islamic Revolution, but I am a mere researcher. But this is what I could gather from my research on the Islamic Revolution over the past 40 years. Thank you so much, Mr. Hadi Masoumi, for this presentation. Mr. Hadi, Dr. Hadi said that the victory of the Islamic Revolution was important for the Palestinian resistance and for the support of the Palestinian resistance, which is Sunni, not Shi'i, but was it through ideological commitment or by sectarian influence? He said that it is important to notice that the Islamic Republic is quite dynamic, and this could affect the decision maker, and that his focus was on the revolutionary attitude towards resistance movements. There may be some contradictions, but we have to set the general framework within four main principles, and that his research was based on his fieldwork in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, and that Iran is quite keen on working with Sunni movements to escape from the accusations of being Shia, of being Rafidi, and other accusations, Safawi. And he mentioned their relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Taliban, etc., and some other examples, the successful examples with Islamic movements was after the 90s, and this was in response to the first paper of Mr. Azimi, as he disagrees with him on his definition of the left and of Sunni Islamic movement. But anyway, there were some exceptions, but there were some scholars who talked about occupation and how to deal with the Zionist entity. They may take another attitude, but he wanted us to understand the revolutionary line of thought, which was based on four main principles, which we have to understand. First of all, countering usurpation in general, and that countering usurpation is one of the most important principles for the Republic, because this entails Sharia proscribed or sanctioned duty, and hence This assumption mistake, regardless of religion or sect, it is a general threat that threatens everyone, and any solution that's not based on the return to Palestine is based on assumption, so should not be agreed upon. Of course, it's no wonder that this is the situation, but what is quite perplexing is the presence of those who normalize relations with Israel. So this principle does not only apply to Palestine, but because in principle, assumption could be a threat to all countries, including Iran. So practically, Iran is defending itself and its future because this issue, if we accept this principle of assumption, it could threaten Iran as well. And the second principle was an avoidance of sectarian fissures or disagreements. So their relations with the resistance movement was based on Muslim duties, and he elaborated quite a lot on Shia fatwas in relation to the resistance of occupation and invaders, even in Sunni areas and under the Sunni Ottoman Empire, in resistance of the British or the Italians in Libya. So the Shia scholars had always given paramount importance to the overall Muslim interest over the Shia interest.
And that's what the scholars used to say in the Islamic world. And then he mentioned that Al-Khomeini mentioned about 545 things or times that he mentioned about Palestine, its people, and the resistance. And he said that there are no Shia interests in Palestine, but rather there is a political and security price that they are paying for supporting Palestine against Israel, and maybe the position of the UK and the USA is because of the position of Iran towards Palestine. And he said that the decision maker of Iran can negotiate everything apart except for the Palestinian issue and the missile issue, and the military capabilities is feared by the West in general because of its threats against Israel. And even in this issue, it led to differences within the Shia family, so to speak, and that some Shia of the classic Shia says that there are or some of the Shia interests are being abandoned because of Palestine. So if the Sunnis are abandoning Palestine, why do we have to pay such a price? We would have make alliance with the United States instead of that. So this line of the Shia thought gives priority to fighting terror, fighting occupation against at the cost of internal tyranny sometimes. And he said that when there are two, when these two options or these two ends are present, then this can be accepted. And he gave an example of Hezbollah in the 80s when there was a sectarian regime in Lebanon, and there was Lebanese and there was Israeli occupation. So the priority was fighting the occupation rather than getting into sectarian infights within Lebanon. And Iran is a democracy, and there have been several elections. So there can be combination between democracy and resistance. But if there is any difference between democracy and resistance, so the resistance comes first. And here, even we can understand the strategy of Iran in Syria. There were 8 rounds before getting into the military operations in Syria, of 8 rounds of negotiations. between the opposition and the regime, but for Iran, it wasn't clear that if there is any or if the regime in Syria is toppled, so who is the replacement, or to have a replacement that will not fight the resistance. In addition to that, he said that we cannot support or provide any support against the occupation if there are separatists in the area, because the separatists are against the spirit of the whole of Ummah spirit in that Iran follows. So if there is only a hostile country, that's fine. If that leads to a hostile state against Islam, or which might lead to a genocide like what happened in Bosnia in the 90s. So if there is an opportunity to introduce the Islamic values, so we don't provide support to the separatist groups. In that area, we can find in that area, that's what we can do. And this is, of course, at the end, he concluded that this is his own understanding of the paper and or of the strategy, but he's not representing any formal authority. Now we move to Mr. Ali Baraka, and then we will go to the commentators. In the name of God, I would like to thank Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for this invitation and for this symposium. And I would like to thank all attendees and speakers. Of course, the victory of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 had a major impact on the resurrection of the spirit of revolution in all of our Islamic nation and within our Palestinian people in specific, especially after the disappointment that the Palestinians felt after the visit of the former Egyptian President Mohammed Anwar al-Sadat to the occupied Jerusalem in the 70s, and then signing the Camp David Accord in September 1978. And then when Egypt was excluded from the fight against the Israeli enemy, which was a major strike against the Palestinian revolution. So in this context, the victory of the Iranian revolution against the Shah Pahlavi was a very important victory for the Palestinians. This great victory was a leverage for the Palestinian cause, resurrected the spirit of resistance and revolution again, and compensated for the absence of Egypt in support of the just cause of the Palestinians. The background of the support of the Islamic Republic of Iran, of the resistance groups against the Israeli entities. I believe that the writer didn't show the examples of the support of the Islamic Republic in Iran against Israel, and he went back in history before the Islamic Republic. I believe that there are political reasons that give Iran the reasons to support the Palestinian resistance against Israel. First, the strategic alliance between the Shah, the toppled Shah regime, with the United States and the Zionist regime. So the Islamic Revolution came against that alliance. That's number two. The revolution in Iran was a revolution against injustice, corruption, and the usurpation of rights. And this, the Zionist regime is usurping our rights, and it was an ally with the Shah regime. So the revolution in Iran would have back the Palestinians against the Israelis. That's why the Iranian Islamic Republic is trying to support the Palestinians by building a regional alliance in the region within the bloc of resistance and defiance in order to face and confront the Israeli. Number three, the regime that was established by the revolution in Iran is an Islamic regime, and it's an Islamic republic. So this oblige the leaders of the Islamic revolution to provide support to all Muslims in the world, because we are all Muslims. Number two, the second point, the Ithna Ashari Shia group, Jerusalem for them is very important, and this is an ideological thing because it is related to the reappearance of Al-Mahdi, the awaited Mahdi. So that's why the Iranian Islamic Republic established Al-Quds Corps, which is or legion, which is very important religiously and ideologically for Iran. As for the steps that were taken by the Iranian Republic to support Palestinians were as follows. First, Imam al-Khomeini, may he rest in peace, when he received Yasser Arafat in Tehran after the victory of the revolution, he said, "Today Iran and tomorrow Palestine," and that was the first statement from him about Palestine. Number two, the Islamic Republic changed the Israeli embassy in Tehran into the Palestinian embassy, and that was the first embassy for Palestine in the world. And although the state of Palestine was not announced yet. Number three, Imam al-Khomeini, the last called the last Friday of the holy month of Ramadan, day for Jerusalem or Al-Quds, as a day that combines the entire Ummah. Four, the Islamic Republic provided military and financial support for the resistance movement since the victory of the revolution until this very day. I have some comments on the research that was presented. First, the researcher focused on the Shia position in the support of the Islamic revolution since the beginning of the 20th century. And he mentioned the revolution in Iraq 1920, the occupation of Libya, the occupation of Palestine by the British, etc., etc. The Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't represent all the Shia in the world. There are some mistakes by some Shia scholars or some Shia parties. Can you blame the Islamic Republic on that? No. But the writer provided examples and fatwas that might another Sunni scholar would say that the Shia were with the crusaders against Saladin. Can you blame that? Can you blame that on the Islamic Republic? No. So if you are speaking about the Islamic Republic, you have to start with from 1979 onwards, and not go back in history. So I disagree that you should go back in history and put the responsibility, whether the advantages or disadvantages that were made by Iran throughout history. Afghanistan was only occupied in 2001 by the United States, and Iran didn't reject that, and it didn't reject the occupation of 2003, and that is against the support of the resistance movement. But later, maybe because it has own interest in that. Later on, it supported or backed Taliban, and it backed the resistance movement in Iraq. So here we don't have the principles. So when you are talking about the principles as they are fighting any usurpation of rights, so here there are usurpation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, later it provided support for the resistance in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we cannot blame Iran, for example, for all the practices of all Islamic movements in the world. The Shia Islamic movements, of course. And we cannot say that Iran is supporting the resistance movement because it is a Shia, because they are a Shia movement. So we should stay away from the sectarian or school of thought narrative. After the fall of the Saddam regime, the Palestinians in Iraq, there were 39,000 in 2003. Now we have 6,000 only, and there were Shia groups that killed them. and they are affected by Iran, and the Palestinians were affected by that. So can I blame Iran for that? Of course not. So I need to to pay attention that there were some incidents that takes place that I can't blame Iran for, but they can, for example, do something to curtail these groups from doing these events. Hamas, for example, at some point visited Tehran, and they asked Iran to protect the Palestinians in Baghdad and in Iraq, and they were communication with Muqtada al-Sadr. At that time, Muqtada al-Sadr was an ally of Iran, and the head of the Palestinian community was presented to him, and a day later he was killed. Can we say Iran killed him? And now al-Sadr is not an ally with Iran. So at the time, al-Sadr was pragmatic. So once again, we should not blame the Islamic Republic for everything. For example, I was in a festival for Hezbollah at the eve of occupying Iraq in 2003, and the speaker was Hezbollah, and Saddam Hussein was still there, and Hassan Nasrallah called the Shia movements in Iraq to reconcile with Saddam Hussein and to face the occupation. All the opposition, the Iraqi opposition, withdrew from the festival, although Hassan Nasrallah has a lot of high value in the Islamic world. They rejected that call by Hassan Nasrallah. Can we blame Iran for that practice? Of course not. The researcher was defending the position of the Shia and resistance, although the title of the research is about the role of Iran and not the role of the Shia sect. He provided a lot of examples from history. I talked about that. I don't want to repeat that. Finally, the support of the Islamic revolution to resist any occupation is a religious duty more than a political duty. So if Turkey is supporting or Iran is doing that, it is a duty on them. And any country, if they are not doing that, then this is a mistake they are making if they don't support. So without any blessing that they are providing, that we are doing this, we are sacrificing our blood, and you are providing the financial support or the material support, because we are defending the ideology of the Muslim, of all Muslims. So this Iranian support is in line with the revolutionary thoughts of the Islamic revolution, which was asserted by Al-Khomeini, and it is continuing with Ali Al-Khamenei. Now, in Hamas, we thank the Islamic Republic in Iran and leadership and people for their continuous support for the Palestinian people, resisting the Zionist people, which strengthened our people to steadfast in their country, especially in the wars of Gaza. And we have seen that in the 4 wars that happened against Gaza. For example, Al-Furqan war in 2008, 2009, the Hajarat al-Sijil, or the Sijil rocks, or the fiery rocks, which happened, Al-Asf al-Ma'kul war in 2014, and Al-Quds sword in 2021. And there was a major role of the Islamic revolution, especially Al-Quds Legion, for supporting the resistance and compensating for them for the losses that they were incurred during these wars. We call upon the Islamic revolution to increase its support for the Palestinian people until the Palestinian people achieve its goals in the removing the occupation and restoring its rights. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Ali Baraka, for your comment. Let me make sure who is the next speaker. Mr. Isam is not with us, so let's see if we have any comments by the attendees here. And then responses by the speakers. Do we have any comment here from the room? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would like to thank the speakers as well as the wise commentator who said very nice words. But as you may expect, I have some brotherly comments on the paper of Mr. Hamid Azimi. First, I would like to thank him for raising the point. Why? Because this is one of the miracles made by Dr. Sami, because for the first time, I see an Iranian raising the sectarian problem, and as a non-Iranian person speaking with such passion. This is a rare image that doesn't happen. But I would like to tell my dear friend Dr. Hamid, first, thank you for raising the issue of the sectarian issue, because it is a problem in the Islamic world that requires to be addressed. Not only the Shia, but even the Sunni problem, all of the sects. This is something that we should tackle. We must not be afraid of raising that issue. If we don't do that, we will not have any development, civilized development. We cannot imagine building a civilization on sectarian thoughts. The first requirements of the civilization is to get over or go beyond the sectarianism, and not to abandon the school of thought. Sectarianism raises strifes within the ummah, and it is against the human brotherhood, rather than not to mention the Islamic brotherhood. And I would like to tell my brother Hamid, although he is younger than me, but he understands better than I do. You know that we in Iran, we have a large sector who prefers Hamas, the Sunni movement, over the backward Shia movement that don't speak at all about resistance. That's why the relation between Iran and the resistance is a principled and deep relation. This is something that we ask God to be our witness on that. We're not saying that for political correctness or anything. I will speak about Malik bin Nabi, who speaks about the trilogy of life: the humankind, the soil, and the spirit. He doesn't speak about the school of thought as the basis for all of these developments. So when we speak about the civilization, we need to look into different things, including the school of thought. That's why I am saying that there was a major development with the Iranian Revolution, and this development has nothing to do with abandoning the school of thought or the madhab, but there is a deep surgery that led to reforming or reformulating the main aspects of the Shia, the school of thought. So Shiaism means precisely the human moral value, contribution to liberate the land and the human causes, which means I will not be a good Shia person if I don't contribute to the good of humanity. So Imam al-Khomeini tried to transform the classical Shia school of thought into the theology of the liberating people. And this is something that we have in the modern history. For example, in Lebanon, from Hezbollah, now it will be unjust to call the movement of Hezbollah as a sectarian movement. However, Did Hezbollah or has Hezbollah abandoned its Shia school of thought? No, but Hezbollah transformed this ideology from defending a certain group to an incentive to liberate all causes in the region. Now, if we speak about the landscape in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon, all of these landscapes, Iran didn't get involved for any sectarian matter. It is for the sake of the Ummah. The same thing, we cannot, I cannot disregard your school of thought. So the land or the homeland and the school of thought is are two of the necessities for any humankind or any human being. That's why, with all due respect, I believe that reading these issues and the results that are coming are not in line with the reality that we have. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank the speakers and the commentator. Since the paper that I wanted to present was not complete, we need to mention some points to understand the dynamics within Iran and how they are reflected outside. We need to talk about the leader who is responsible for the major points in the constitution and the other spaces that allow others to move within this framework, even if they are in contradiction with some of the details. For example, talking about the negotiations, which were mentioned by Dr. Ahmadian. Although the main value which the revolution was built on, it was a revolution against the United States as an enemy. However, according to the statement of Dr. Musabian, who was one of the negotiators during the time Hassan Rafsanjani and at the time of Rouhani, and the President Khatami was running the nuclear file. Musabian was a very important figure, and he made a statement that Al-Khamenei was not in line in the time of Rouhani, or he was against the strategy that was followed by Rouhani, Ahmadinejad, and Rafsanjani for the negotiations. And now he is against the direct negotiations with the United States. And he stated that in front of the people and in front of the politicians that the United States will not keep its promises, and that the negotiations can only be achieved through the might and the power. Mr. Khamenei, Sayyid Khamenei, the leader, he stated so. The leader is making this statement before the people and before the politicians, and at the same time he is saying, I believe in those politicians who are running the negotiations. They are our sons, and he supports the elected president in his policy. So we need to understand the dynamics and how we can combine between the faqih, the wilayat al-faqih, and the policy in the Iran. This is the president, and this is his policy, and this is the spiritual leadership. So to get that all of these files, or to understand these files, we need to understand the strategic purpose, the mechanisms, and the allies. The main purpose or the main strategic aim of the revolution, as it was explained, was the resistance and independence, or independence meaning to resist against the Israeli and the US enemies, because they are two sides of the same coin. But what are the mechanisms that can be followed? There is a question, for example, why Iran is not getting into direct war with Israel and destroying Israel with its rockets. When we were in a war, at war with Saddam Hussein, that group that was mentioned by Dr. Azimi, they called part of the revolutionary guards to go into the south of Lebanon to get engaged in a direct war against Israel. I believe after 1 week or after some time, he sent a message to, or the Khomeini sent a message calling them to get back. And they asked them, let's suppose that you succeeded in this war. This country and this territory, or to whom should be given back? It will be given back to the people who opened their lands for the Israeli enemy, because some part of the Lebanese people, they opened their doors for the Israelis and welcomed them. This is a fact. This is a reality. And Al-Khomeini said, when you finish this war and you succeed, who are you going to give this land to? So go back, and just a few of you will stay there to provide a training for the sons of this territory. And that was the main factor of exporting the revolution in its core meaning, and not with the model of that group, the group that to whom Muntadhari and Hashemi were affiliated, and who were executed because of killing some members inside Iran from those who are contradicting them from the other party.
This may be off the radar of the world, but those who were at the time of the early years after the revolution know the dynamics within the Revolutionary Guard and would understand. Of course, I understand that part of the paper was not presented and was misunderstood, and he's going to elaborate. But this is actually the mechanism. Iran does not engage in direct war until the end. They would support with missiles, etc. But if you have people who are aware, who in Palestine, in Syria, in South Lebanon, they may. But when they see that there is an American project to divide the region from Iraq to Syria, also to disintegrate Turkey into Kurdish area and Turkish area, yes, in this case, our brethren from the Sunni school were not with us. So we needed they had to find out that there was no other way but to ally with the Shia in Syria. Many of the people who were on our side and who were killed and who were engaged in Syria were allies with Iran, and their purpose was primarily resistance. We might talk about it. Many may disagree, but as Iranians, there was no economic interest regarding a gas pipeline or whatever. That's actually what happened to us in terms of reputation and other economic repercussions because of our engagement in Syria was multiple times more than any gains we would make. So what Mr. Hamid pointed out was, in that spirit, why did we have to choose some allies from the Shia? Thank you, Mr. Adil Baraka, and I'm proud to have come to know you over the past few years. We have this important friendship. But of course, Dr. Hamid elaborated on the internal issues in Iran, although the title was concerning the foreign relations. So he talked about the three parties in Iran, left, right, and but he didn't connect them to any figures. Who were the people, the well-known figures of the right, left, or the center, or the third party? And he didn't talk about the policy of Iran towards its surroundings. He talked about its relations with Taliban, with Iraq, etc. But what we are looking for were the relations of Iran as a state with the outside world, not the relations between certain political stratum with the outside. So I would want this issue to be further explained. So who were the figures who stood out in this context, and also the relations between Iran and its Arab and Sunni surroundings? Okay, then I can't hear the speaker. Yeah. I'm sorry, because my laptop battery was running out. But I would like to explain first that we're here supposed to be describing the reality, not what should be. So I may have detailed quite a little on this introduction about the identity versus the Ummah affiliation. And I am a person who have worked on this issue since the beginning of the Arab Spring. And I don't believe that much studies have been made in this discipline, in this field. But that was my original research project since the beginning of the Arab world, actually. And this shock, I have to say, it was personal as a researcher, that I was running into something that I did not expect after years of study and research in this field. But I had to be clear and honest in describing the situation in Iran and its impact on regional relations with Iran, to understand what we in Iran have to do, as well as our brothers in this region and in Islamic movements. In terms of what Mr. Al-Masoumi, Dr. Al-Masoumi mentioned, I believe there is no contradiction between what I presented as you said. The disagreement was merely because you said that in the mindset of the Iranian leadership and the politicians in Iran, colonialism was given priority over addressing the issue of authoritarianism. What I said was merely to explain the reasons why the regime in Iran reached to this sort of prioritization. Was it the actual ideas or ideology of the Islamic revolution. Actually, no. Actually, in the Shia heritage, the issue of authoritarianism are paramount to anything else for historical reasons. But that's why I try to explain it. And the final part of my article, which I was unable to present, was concerned with me. I was trying to talk about this transformation from in Iranian perspective, from an Ummah regional based understanding to a national territorial ideology. It doesn't mean that its relation with its surroundings were bad, but it was secondary. And you talked a lot on the relations with Sunni movements, such as Hamas, but they, in the first place, were liberation movements rather than revolutionary. So for them, they're trying to liberate their territories rather than overcoming or fighting the authoritarian regimes for liberalization. So, but then the Second Republic, as I mentioned, moved to a more national sectarian attitude. This means that relations with the Sunni community changed from relations with non-governmental actors to relations with states. We have an issue, not our relations with the Muslim Brotherhood or with the Saada or Happiness Party or that party or this or that party, but the question for Iranian politicians is our relations with Turkey on the one hand and the Gulf on the other. Those are the most important axes that are important or paramount in the foreign, in the regional relations of Iran. So in my understanding, for the time being, at this stage, Iran regards Sunni movements from the perspective of its relations with international actors or with state actors, basically. Unlike what it used to do with which is to deal with non-governmental actors. So it is important to recognize that this shift, to see it in that context. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamid. Now I will give the chance to Mr. Hassan Ahmadian, but could you please, Dr. Hassan, answer the question related to the theory of the center and the peripheries or the surroundings? So Iran exited from the center, as you mentioned, in a counter-containment movement, and you said that there was an international attitude that is confrontational with the West, but how would you assess Iranian attitude to regional issues such as Palestine, Iran, Syria, and Yemen, where Iran is accused of following a policy that's either sectarian or regional or local? In light of this theory, can Iranian policies be assessed against that theory? Of course, many mentioned the issue of confrontation or looking for new spaces or room for counter-containment. So how would you see these issues in light of your theory? Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Yes, go ahead, please. Thank you for this question. I have learned a lot from this quite enriching debate. In terms of your question, I understand that in this vision, the removal of Iran from the center and the containment has to be confronted. Actually, those were imposed upon Iran in the first place, and then Iran changed from the reactionary phase to a counter-action, and in innovating new actions in the region, and that's where the axis of resistance emerged. On the other hand, there was no static situation. The situation was quite dynamic, looking for changes to find or establish a new pressure on this new axis, which is led by Iran, which has been led by Iran as a collective framework to confront those collective pressures. So Iran used to focus on this, but on the other hand, the adversaries were also innovating in their approaches, including, which I may be mistaken in, which is sectarianism, because sectarianism was one of the tools of this conflict. And I undertook a research on this issue for a research I was undertaking, particularly sectarianism, since the beginning of the Arab Spring. Sectarianism was unprecedentedly rising. So Iran in Syria, Yemen, and Egypt is regarded in sectarian terms, while if we go back, and here I disagree with the other speakers or my colleagues here, if you look back, there are two main principles in the regional and international policies of Iran over decades. And despite the nuance or the minor differences along the spectrum, there are two principles that have been unwavering in foreign policy in Iran. The first was the support of revolutionaries. This revolutionary may be Marxist, Sunni, Shia, call them what you may. Also, Iran is supporting Venezuela against the United States. The important thing is to stand up for the United States, which is the antagonist of the Muslim dominance and the Muslim. And there is no hope for Muslims to stand for themselves as long as the U.S. monopolizes power. And also, the second principle is that the work for Iran and its allies against occupiers. As you can see, after the Arab Spring, there were movements who stood in the face of the United States, but also in the face of Iran, and Iran stopped supporting those movements because they contradicted its second principles. So under those two principles, supporting revolutionists and supporting those who did not stand in the face of resistance axis, I believe that Iran was able to connect to its surrounding to get closer with its surrounding, even under the sectarian rhetoric invoked in this field. And it's very easily, since Iran represents a sectarian minority, can be stigmatized as a sectarian with a sectarian attitude, but the strategy, the general strategy of the state, which can be seen since the beginning of the Islamic Republic, is far from sectarian. But the problem is this division has had its implications, and some of those implications were that you would attract only those who are close to you in sectarian terms because of the existing sectarian division, which is used against the Iranian state, although you would find no sentence or a single statement by the leader of the revolution or of the Iranian state to use any Shia term, but they talk about Muslim unity. But if they were guided by sectarian belonging or affiliation, then they would act otherwise, or they would speak otherwise. So in my understanding, those are the most important principles. And as you mentioned, and as you know, at the center, there are many Muslim communities as well that are getting closer, even, but with the rise of sectarianism and the events after the Arab Spring, because actually even the Syrian regime was regarded as Shia, although because of it being supported by Iran, although its support is not based on sectarian terms, far from it, it's on strategic terms. I hope I have answered your question. I have only 2 points. When I talked about the history of the fatwas, I wasn't speaking from a sectarian point of view, but it is the description of the reality. So this revolutionary rhetoric in Iran, of those who are taking the front line, the forefront of the revolution and development over the past 4 decades, have their root in Shia jurisprudence. That doesn't mean that it's counter Sunni. I'm only trying to say that this is an ideological extension of the Shia ideology. Are there exceptions? Yes, of course. There are scholars from both Sunni and Shia backgrounds who dealt with the occupiers. There are actually some scholars outside Iran who are calling for normalization with Israel, who are criticizing the Iranian government. So that's not even a sectarian issue. As for Afghanistan and Iraq, Mr. Barika, first of all, the United States had decided to occupy or to invade, and no one in the world could stand in the face of that invasion. And whoever stood in the face of the United States in 2001 and 2003 would be destroyed. It happened in Afghanistan, it happened in Iraq. But what did Iran do? They avoided working with the Americans. And I actually, of course, these issues need many details and much more time, but I sat with leaders from Iraq and Iran, and I jotted down many remarks, and I might issue this in a publication in a couple of years. There were many disagreements where the Iraqis left a session, both seculars and Islamists decided to go to a political transition. They were independent. It wasn't because of Iran. Actually, they disagreed and argued with General Soleimani and the Iraqi leaders, and he was told, you Iranians do not understand who Saddam Hussein was. He said, I will stand with Yazid and Shumar behind Saddam, and General Suleiman said, do not agree, but at the same time, you cannot stop them because it's their own country. So we cannot make that decision for them. So that was the line. So they decided to go into that transition, and then they decided for the resistance, and Iran was in support of resistance, and it supported the Shia resistance, the Kataib and Mahdi al-Muhandas, as well as the Sadr movement, who killed more than 2,500 US soldiers, as well as the Sunni resistance, Salafi and non-Salafi Sunni resistance, who killed as many US soldiers as well. And so due to this pressure, the Americans withdrew from Iraq, but the agreement wasn't 100% negative or positive or commonly agreed. And they refused, the Iraqis refused to install or introduce judicial immunity in the agreement that was reached at the time. So what I'm trying to say, I heard a lot from our brothers in Palestine. The resistance was not supported because of being Palestinians, but in all revolutions after the fall of the regime. I saw that in Iraq after the fall of ISIS. We had Sunni revenge. So you would see that families would take reprisals against one another. So in Iraq, they got rid of an authoritarian killing, murderous regime who killed thousands of Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia people. But what happened after it was toppled was mutual reprisals, including Palestinians who were not in support of the regime, and who Sunnis and Shia. But in this case, after the fall of the regime, we cannot actually say that those killings were directed. So I could say that the Baathi Shia people who were killed were multiple times more than those from Sunni Baathist party, because they were easy to target. Thousands actually were killed by the Shia themselves in revenge for them being Baathist, for them being pro-regime, not because of them being Shia or Sunni. The same would happen in Syria if the regime falls. Would I say that those people are killing the Alawites? No, they would be killing the loyalists to the regime. They would even kill the Sunnis who are loyal to the regime. So we really need to break this down away from the sectarian considerations. So as someone who's living in Iraq and as a researcher in Iraqi issues, the Sadr movement is not an ally to Iran, and actually it used to pressure Iran to stop it from supporting the Sadri movement. But at the time, Iran was motivated to support this movement because it stood up against the Americans. So, but the actual allies of Iran in Iraq are very few. Even Mr. Baqir Hakim, he had a vision totally different from that of Iran. So even those who are allied, such as Hezbollah, who is homogeneous in every level with Iran, there are very few. Many of the Shia and the other movements that are supported by Iran or share common interests with Iran are not totally in agreement with Iran. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all of our speakers and commentators, Mr. Hamid Azimi, Dr. Hassan Ahmadian, Dr. Hadi Al-Masoumi, as well as all of those who are present. I thank you so much for this very fruitful discussion and very enriching papers that open the horizon for many issues and questions which we may embark upon tomorrow when we will start a debate. I don't know if Dr. Ahmed can join us tomorrow. We would be welcome. I believe we have shared the link with you. It's at 11 o'clock at our time, 11:30 Tehran time. Before we conclude, there are some awards and certificates that we would like to share with our speakers, and we will share it with those who are joined over remotely. The last session tomorrow is going to be in English, and we will have 4 academics and intellectuals in English, including Syed Hamid Moussawi from Tehran University and Dr. Atifa Tughyani from Tehran University and Dr. Sarhan from Marmara University and Dr. Mujib Al-Rahman from Berkeley, and also Dr. Qutbi Al-Mahdi, the former Sudanese ambassador to Iran. All of them will join us tomorrow in this final session, which is going to be in English. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum.